Hey, hi everybody. Welcome to the Supply Side Podcast. Happy to get everybody back together again for another great discussion around the healthcare industry. Today I have with me Ben Mink. Ben is the founder of GTC Consulting, but really we're going to dig into that. He has a tremendous background in the area of the DEA, drug regulation, license management for drug distributors, and all the complexities are associated with that. So, Ben, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Tony. It's an honor to be here.
Oh, it's great to have you. So, Ben, it's always helpful just to get started is to give people a little bit of your background. And you and I know each other because my company, iRemedy, is involved in medical supply and drug distribution. You have a company that does, advisory services on licensing, okay, by pharmaceutical industry participants. And I have to tell you right out of the gate that I think it's one of the most, it's a classic case of screwed up regulation in the United States. It has a good cause and a good purpose. Compliance is extremely important, clearly. And there's a lot of great people doing great work. But the part that I struggle with is, I think you know, is a drug distribution company in the United States has to be licensed in if we want to sell in all 50 states, to all 50 states. And every state, you license at the state level. And so you got to deal with 50 different states. This is true, by the way, in a lot of industries. Like, I know it's true in finance, banking, and investment banking, because I've done a fair amount of work in that area. I think it's also true, like with gun laws and other things. And it's just the nature of the United States of America, the whole federalist approach, right? How much power is at the national level? And I always tell people, I go, politically, of course, I'm very active. I have a lot of things going on in that area, but, I could probably be described as a libertarian. I'm a little bit of a guy that believes in limited government, especially at the federal level. Having said that, I would say this is the one area where we could improve the way that we manage, compliance. I'm kind of contrary to my own experience. But we're going to jump into all that. Ben, if you can start by just kind of giving us, a little bit of that background of where you started and how you ended up where you are. Then we're going to dig into that because there's some pretty cool things going on there.
Yeah, so I have a little bit of a unique background. I consider myself to be sort of a hybrid individual. I have a strong law enforcement background, but also a pretty strong regulatory and risk mitigation background on the industry side of things. So, unlike many of the other counterparts or folks that do what I do, that spend their entire career in the government and then retire and sort of do this type of thing in retirement, I took a very sort of different approach. So certainly a law enforcement guy, that's where I started out, have a tremendous passion for public health and public safety, I think, which really kind of fuels even what I do to this day. It's so important to me to protect the public and really also on the other side of that, legitimate health care. I mean, to me, that's in the same vein of protecting the public is legitimate health care. And legitimate healthcare is under attack on so many fronts, both from, floods of gray market product that enter the United States and even that is circulating globally. We have this, major illicit fentanyl crisis that's happening in the country right now where the opioid crisis has really turned into a very specific fentanyl crisis. But
I'm going to interrupt you for a second. The interesting thing, I do want to talk about product quality issue. That's the area that I'm very focused on. The thing about the fentanyl thing that kind of surprises me, though, right, is that people tend to underestimate the impact of that. I don't know why that is, but we all talk about it a lot, and law enforcement talks about it a lot. The immigration and customs enforcement people are now on it, under the current administration. I guess people would argue they were on it before, but not to the aggressive status that we have today. But, Trump is clearly very focused on this subject. But aside from that, this is a massively horrible drug. like it's phenomenal. And it works at way. I think when people think about this drug abuse problem with like a fentanyl, it's sort of like they see that that drug addicted person, and it's all this low life person who's on drugs or whatever. Like they look down on that person, but there's a pathway to this drug that is really, your average guy went out and had knee surgery, got addicted to the opioid, went for a cheaper solution, which might have been heroin, which is hard to believe, but true. And then that becomes fentanyl. Like it's a lot of these people who are dying and or otherwise addicted are really pretty innocent people, frankly. It's an incredible, massive problem. It really is. So
Well, and sadly, you have states that have deregulated or made it legal to possess things like fentanyl and heroin,
yeah,
and that unfortunately has, once you remove the consequence, I think that has a devastating effect. And I mean, you could see that in the statistics for those states that their opioid related overdoses significantly increased after they delegalized or they removed
yeah,
regulation saying that you can't have this. So
yeah.
it's really unfortunate that those types of things have occurred.
Yeah, and it depends on how far you want to go with the conspiracy thinking, but arguably China and the cartels in Mexico, love this whole program. It's a real interesting moneymaker for them. But it's really a phenomenal story. Look, I'm 66 years old, and when you've been around for a while, you lived through the war on drugs, right? That started with Nixon and then Reagan. Nancy Reagan said, just say no. There are all these things that happen. Okay. But man, you're hitting a level with fentanyl that has just never been seen before. I saw a guy was talking about, he's critical of an enforcement scenario where they only got a pound of fentanyl. He said, what's the point? It's only a pound. Well, a pound of fentanyl will kill, it's unbelievable. It's like 1 million people. It's just, that's an incredibly powerful drug.
Extremely
Yeah,
potent drug,
yeah,
and unfortunately, it's not incredibly difficult to make. The precursor chemicals are widely available and easy to obtain from China, and they've been coming from China over to Mexico across the border for a very long time. It's widely known, and unfortunately, it's there's not a lot of enforcement when you're dealing with foreign countries and foreign entities. It's very hard to stop that supply. I was a source for Reuters News and still am confidentially in some regards, but and they did a story on the precursor chemicals coming over from China, and it's unbelievable how easy they are to obtain and how easy it is to get pill presses and how profitable that sort of activity is. So it's really unfortunate.
yeah, yeah. So, well, that's interesting. We might dig into that a little bit. You're also talking, your comment briefly just on the kind of like the global quality and contamination issue that also exists. One of the things I constantly complain about in the work that we do, and I'm a big advocate, sort of like, let's say, rebalancing the whole global pharmaceutical manufacturing world. Currently, as you and I know very well, it's China and it's India and it's some other Asian countries. And, of course, other things happening in other places. But between the APIs and the actual manufacturing, it's mostly China, Asia. And, they just don't have the regulatory environment that we have. And, there's this notion that the FDA is inspecting facilities in China. Yeah, I mean, come on. I can't believe anybody believes that that's actually happening, but it's not. And I had some personal experience here in our work on Operation Warp Speed. We we import 1 billion things, as part of that process. We were working with all these Chinese manufacturers, and we needed more volume of a particular product. And the one chairman of the warehouse said, well, I've got another factory. It's kind of like saying my brother over in another town runs another factory. he could do this. We could set him up. He could make some for you. I go, oh, yeah, that'd be great. Does he have 510K, which you would know as the FDA, call it certificate for a facility to make a particular product? He goes, no, but he could use mine. Well, no, that's not how it works. So there's really an amazing problem in this quality and contamination issue and that's why in the beginning of our conversation, I was saying that, yeah, we want a regulated environment, right? Because we want to address these things. But you're starting to say, so you started on the law enforcement side, right? And was that, local police? I know at one point you ended up DEA, what was that path that you're talking?
Yeah, so I started out at a city police department, sort of a, a rough city from a crime perspective. I started out there, and I actually processed with the FBI at one point in time. That was my career goal, was to become an FBI special agent. And they had a hiring freeze in 2010 timeframe. I'm like, well, what am I going to do now? That kind of threw a curveball in my career goals. But at the same time, I was really passionate. I've always been about drug enforcement. And so I was kind of looking like, what am I going to do? And an opportunity opened up with the Alaska State Troopers. So I applied. At the time. National Geographic had that TV show, Alaska State Troopers.
Oh, yeah.
So I thought, wow, this would be a unique adventure. I probably should have told my wife before I applied in retrospect. But
yeah, well, you were in Ohio or somewhere, weren't you, in the Midwest? With that,
I started out in Louisiana, in central Louisiana.
So you took her from Louisiana up to Alaska?
Yeah. So a big cultural change and climate change. So it was really, I can recall the conversation specifically telling my wife, hey, the Alaska State Troopers want to hire me. How do you feel about living in Alaska? And my wife was pregnant with our firstborn, our daughter. And I'm like, oh my goodness, this is not going to go over well.
What city did you move to?
So I moved to the Kenai Peninsula, Kenai, Soldotna, relatively close to the Cook Inlet, but it was considered one of the few urban posts that Alaska had. That's where you kind of start out at.
Okay.
So that was a selling point for my wife. I'm like, I think they have a movie theater.
It's a big city.
It's the big city.
How many people are in that area?
It's still a relatively small rural area. I mean, we did have, hardware stores and gas stations and restaurants. So it wasn't, completely the middle of nowhere, but it certainly wasn't like an Anchorage, for example, which is a major city.
Yeah. Cool. So how you did that?
Yeah. Yep. So I did the Alaska State Trooper thing, and it was an incredible experience. I mean, an unbelievable adventure. The training was, top. I mean, you can't receive better training. Unique training, survival training. They throw us off a boat in the middle of the ocean. We swim to an island. We do survival training. No food and water. Building shelter. Really? A lot of kind of unique things that they only really experience in those types of areas.
Yeah.
So really, really exciting stuff. But my focus there really was, I wanted to improve my drug enforcement and investigative capabilities. So I spent a lot of time investigating drug crimes and working drug crimes because I was just fascinated by it. And so that's really where that kind of took off. I went to a number of schools that the state sent me to, cultivating marijuana, pill identification, a bunch of different, schools that I could get my hands on. And that's sort of, I think, where things took off. A couple of years, I was there for maybe 2.5 years, not a very long time, but my wife and myself, after realizing, boy, raising a kid by yourself with no grandparents is a difficult process.
Yeah, and it's not like you can jump down to Louisiana in an hour.
It's a significant cost to get there and time and everything else. So I told her at the time, I said, you know what, I'm gonna try and find a drug enforcement type role in the lower 48, hopefully closer to family, and we'll see what happens. So I called the sheriff at the parish, which is sort of another word
Yep.
for county,
County. Yeah.
at the parish that I was working in for the city. And I said, hey, I was a city police officer there, and I'd really like to get, back down that direction. Do you have any openings? I'm really interested in narcotics. And they really pretty much hired me directly into the narcotics department. And I went right into, in a very short period of time, doing undercover work on a federal task force with the DEA and the National Guard. So uh, a really fun experience, unique experience. They sent me to undercover schools and narcotic schools, and
Right.
I really made the most of it. I just said, hey, give me any and all assignments. I want to do them.
Yeah.
Uh, Looking back, that seems like a dangerous decision, but it
So,
was.
so when you're undercover, first off, like, was your appearance different than it is now? I mean, you're a pretty conservative looking guy. I mean, did you
I had a longer beard,
had a
and
lot of hair?
I didn't dress very nice. Typically jeans and a t-shirt, and yeah, I definitely never was really in my uniform or
Yeah.
showed my badge to people. It's kind of the nature of that is to keep that fairly concealed.
Yeah. And then that was in the local community there is the deal.
Yeah, yeah. So I mean, we worked in other parishes. We supported other parishes, and we would sub out, undercover guys to different areas from time to time. But I spent most of my time there really buying drugs. I mean, that was my whole capacity, was buying drugs and then executing no-knock search warrants and working with confidential informants. So it was a very exciting time. It was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed that capacity. I was finally doing something that I felt like I was meant to do.
Yeah. 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 Met your calling sort of thing. Seems like it'd be a little on the dangerous side, which is fine, except when you start having babies and stuff like that. I'm not sure it's the best
Yeah, yeah,
family. Uh,
that was the part that wasn't well thought through when I originally kind of etched that plan in my mind. It did. Unfortunately, I ended up in the hospital a couple times with pretty serious injuries, and I kind of decided at that time with my wife, the last time I was in the hospital as a police officer, I had gotten thrown through some glass, and decided that maybe this isn't a great long-term career with little kids, and my wife was, sort of pleading with me, hey, is there something else you can fulfill this passion in that maybe doesn't require, this sort of schedule and this sort of risk. And so
yeah,
I
because
started.
you're even if they don't find out if you're a cop, you're still just generally running with you know, an uncontrolled group of people. You know what I mean? Like people are just wild and crazy and drunk and high and
You
just did
spend a
mess.
lot of time with the criminal element.
Yeah, they're not a real rational group of people most of the time.
Not at all.
Yeah, so you left there, moved on.
So yeah, so I at the time an opportunity came up that was sort of a unique switch for me. Um, I actually took a position with Kansas City Southern Railway Company. So at that time, they were a new sheriff was coming in the South. It's very political around election time,
Yeah,
whether or not you get to keep your job. And so I started looking and found a position with KCS, and it was a great opportunity. It was a catastrophic claims and litigation manager. So I hopped into that capacity and was managing, multi-million-dollar settlements and, attending, civil litigation hearings and testifying and negotiating with employees that had been involved in pretty serious train accidents. So I mean, including the public, people that get hit at, crossings and catastrophic derailments, those sort of things. So I got very good as that sort of built my skill set as a risk manager because there was so much
Yeah,
liability,
yeah,
and you were
yeah.
dealing
I
with so much
see
money.
that. Yeah, moving over to the compliance side, it gave you just a different look at, like, say, risk management. Yeah, I don't know if you're familiar with the Bright Line. It's a high-speed train they put in here in Florida. It goes from Orlando to Miami now. Okay, and yeah, it's high speed, relatively speaking. At certain points, it gets moving right along, like say 80, 90 miles an hour. And so people pull up to the crossing, and they're yeah, you could look to the right and you're not going to see the train because it's doing 90. Okay. And people aren't used to that. They're used to trains going, let's say, 30. So they don't see the train and they'll go around like the gates or whatever, and they get slammed. It's unbelievable. It's almost like they say it's like suicide by bright line. Like people are walking out in front of it, getting hit by it. I mean, they've only been in business. It's been a couple of years now. They've had, I don't know exactly, but it's been like a dozen people that have been killed. Even to the point where when you go to take the Brightline line, you're like, man, I hope they don't hit anybody because they'll throw the schedule out. About a month ago, a fire truck did it. They went around the cross guards, and with a big fire truck. And the guy probably looked over there and, oh yeah, I don't see the train, and I got to go because I got an emergency. And he shifts that thing into gear and he pulls around, and they hit it full on, sent that
Uh,
fire truck flying. Yeah,
it's
it,
terrible. It's
it's
amazing how often it
It's
happens. So
amazing how often it happens. That's the reason I was bringing it up is you would think it never happens, but it's like people do it. And it's still so bad that like the police will work the crossings. They'll be like, they put up extra signs. They do all kinds of stuff trying to break the habit, of people. But it's bizarre that the railroads have that much stuff going on. So it,
it is surprising. And so one of my major duties there was I collected the footage from the locomotive. So I would go download the hard drives when would be an accident, and I would review that footage, and I would create a 10-minute clip, basically 5 minutes before, 5 minutes after the incident. So I was responsible for the chain of custody with that evidence, or processing that evidence,
yeah,
and then obviously writing reports internally for the company as to the who, what, where, when, why, and how.
yeah.
But it was really, really interesting how often that happened. I mean, even sadly, suicide. Several people
Yes.
commit
That's what's
suicide.
happening with the Bright Line. People are just, they walk out in front of the train, and it's, yeah. I mean, I always view the suicide thing as a mental health problem. So, you hate to be critical of people because they're mentally ill at that point. So it's tragic. But it's just kind of selfish because if that train engineer that's running that train, he has to kind of live with this thing, right?
Yep.
It's a terrible
Yeah,
situation.
it's really sad what they have to
Yeah.
deal with emotionally after something like that.
Yeah. Well, it is an interesting combination for you, though, because it took your drug enforcement background and then sort of combined it with this other sort of, like you said, risk management or compliance management. It gives you it's a really interesting balance, to the, on the street, undercover, getting thrown through the window kind of thing.
It definitely makes you. I would say, if anything, it made me think more strategically
Yeah.
about risk management. When you're responsible for a multi-billion-dollar corporation, for their, risk and liability, and the stakeholders are counting on you to manage that appropriately. There's an immense amount of pressure. Number one, I mean, an immense amount of pressure. But you get very good at strategy development and starting to think ahead, like how can we prevent these sort of things? How can we put, what more effective controls can we put in place to prevent this sort of thing from occurring, or this type of claim from happening? So you don't just think about, how do we manage this once we're in litigation? You start to think about, okay, well, all of these things came up in litigation, all of these factors, or these were the allegations. So how do I prevent those sort of allegations from occurring in future litigation? So it's kind of like you you really learn to develop a strategy that helps the corporation. And I think it's really benefited me because it's just provided a really unique sort of experience to what I do.
Yeah, yeah. I actually, now that you say that, I can look back over some of our business conversations and I see that same sort of thinking that you have, strategically. So did you leave there and start GTC, or did you, that was the,
So
well,
so
you
before
ended up, because you ended up at the other, you were in a deal for a while, right? Give me the
yeah.
trail.
So I was still, I still had the passion for drug enforcement. So while I was there, I was still entertaining the idea of trying to, figure out a route back into drug enforcement, but I knew it wasn't going to be in a law enforcement capacity just because I had already gone down that road and was at the
Yeah,
place with kids and family. It didn't make sense to go back there. And even in terms of my career progression, it wasn't in the cards. So I started to look at, potential opportunities that fit sort of what I was doing at KCS with the claims and litigation management, and combining that with the drug enforcement background. And an opportunity opened up in Springboro, Ohio, with a company called Miami-Luken. Miami-Luken is or was a regional wholesale drug distributor, registered with the DEA and licensed in several states to distribute RX products, including controlled substances. And they were advertising at the time. A headhunter was looking for a DEA compliance director. And I'm reading through the job description, and I'm like, wow, this sounds like this was written for me. Like, this is my passion. This is my
yeah,
background.
yeah.
So I applied just thinking, we'll see what happens. And the headhunter called me. Long story short, they had a couple of former DEA guys that they were looking at. They were looking at me. They ended up offering me the position. And I was like, wow, this is unbelievable. And felt like I interviewed well, like it went well. So I took the role, moved from Louisiana, to Shreveport, Louisiana at the time, to Springboro, Ohio. And I get there and I'm, just kind of getting my feet wet. I've, never really worked in that capacity necessarily, but I'm like, this all sounds like it's in my skill set. So I remember the president and CEO at the time, Tony Routini, introduced himself to me and he took me around the facility and, kind of showed me the ins and outs. And I was like, man, this is a really nice guy. Seems to be a great company, great people. Like I was really excited about the opportunity.
But
Well, I'm
how big were they? Because I kind of know the story a little bit, but just give me an idea, like how big, like how many employees, or how big was the facility?
yeah,
I don't know.
so they were less than 150 employees. So I
Okay, but
mean,
they were good size. Yeah,
decent
yeah,
sized company. Yeah,
yeah,
I would classify them as sort of a regional, small to mid-sized distributor. I mean,
yeah.
they weren't certainly weren't the big three, Cardinal, McKesson, Amerisource, but they were a solid mid-sized distributor. They'd been in business for many years, like third generation owner. So they'd been around for a while.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, so good. Seemed to be a fantastic company. Everybody was really nice and friendly, and most, I would say, the majority of the employees were older. I would say over 50, the majority. So that was I was like, wow, this is great. Long tenured employees. They seem to be happy here. I was very optimistic about it. Well, we'll come to find out, the company had some issues with the DEA and with the state of West Virginia for their controlled substance distributing. And this was something that, people have asked me, did you know when you took the position? And I'm like, no, I didn't have a clue. I was just
Yeah,
excited to find a job description that met my skill set.
yeah.
So,
I mean, obviously they should have fully disclosed, but their problem was if they did that, nobody would have taken the job.
yeah. I'm assuming that was the that was the thinking, because
Yeah.
I can assure you, if I had known at the time, I wouldn't have taken the job.
No, I mean Well, especially because it's compliance. Like if you're a sales rep or you're whatever, you'd be like, oh, well, not my problem. But compliance, you,
Exactly. Yeah,
yeah.
no, it was like jumping on a grenade in a trench. It was you're gonna experience some growing pain if you survive. But yeah, it was what I thought was, really terrible circumstances, and I would say they still were terrible circumstances. The situation that the company was in ended up really being a fantastic growth opportunity for me, and that's sort of what I embraced it as at the time, and that's what kept me going, was knowing that at the end of this is going to be just a remarkable learning opportunity for me and growth opportunity, because I had a front row seat to, congressional testimony before the United States Congress, and criminal charges against executives of a company for distributing controlled substances, and then hordes of civil litigation from states, all over the country. So that really ended up being a unique opportunity, and I just took it as I took the responsibility I had very seriously, because my passion had never changed. So I immediately from day one when I got there, I said, how can we make this company better? And so I started immediately with, rewriting the standard operating procedures. I said that we have to start there. We have to recreate the foundation here. We have to enhance the foundation because there's issues and what we're doing isn't working. So we have to change. And that's what a lot of people don't realize in a company that's, been around for more than 50 years and most of the employees are older. There's a lot of change averse people, or they're very
Yeah.
fearful of change
Yeah.
because something that they've always done in their mind has worked. So they kind of look at it like, well, why change something that isn't broken? And a lot of times people don't realize when something's broken because they're too close to it,
Yeah.
and they're not aware. And I think there was a lot of that. There was a lot of naivete. I think regulation had changed, or at least the enforcement had changed so substantially, or the interpretation had changed. And so those sort of things really, unfortunately, in the case of Miami-Luken, led to their ultimate demise. I mean, at the end of the day, I believe they went bankrupt maybe a few years ago, but it was really just kind of unfortunate circumstances of we didn't change fast enough. We didn't make the right decisions when we should have. And again, everyone that I had met, they were all good people. I mean, they were all, yeah. I mean, if you had walked into Miami-Luken today, or when I walked in, you probably would have had the exact same perspective. These are good, hardworking American people that are trying to do the right thing, that care about healthcare, that have families and lives and children. And so to me, that made the responsibility just so much heavier, because I felt such a burden for all of the people at the company to do what I could to make sure that the company had its best shot of surviving everything that was happening.
Yeah.
So it really was a unique experience, but I came in, rewrote the standard operating procedures. The company was very good. The president, Tony, was like, hey, I trust you. I think he had gotten to the point that he didn't know what to do.
Yeah.
He was confused. And that's where a lot of stakeholders, that's where a lot of chairmen, boards, company presidents are with compliance a lot of times, because regulations are overlapping. Guidance is sometimes conflicting. There isn't a lot of clarity for people.
Yeah,
And
the
so,
regulators, a lot of times, so they'll push it on you. They'll be like, well, this is the rule, you figure it out. And then later, if we don't agree with you, that's your problem. There's a lot of that goes on. And to your point, like a CEO, and the role I play, although I'm pretty involved at a compliance level, I sort of grew up in the compliance world, insurance and healthcare. But you get well, geez, I don't they're used to living in a world that's black and white, where the rules are clear, right? Like say in accounting, in the accounting world, even though it can be very complex and you get audited and you have taxes and you have all these things, But in the end, it's a pretty black and white situation. There's a set of standards that everybody tends to agree to, the auditors and the accounting, boards and all these different things. And that's it. And by the way, it's a national standard, right? Okay, I mean, this is the thing. And then when you move into this, and it's more like, well, there's rules and there's standards, but in some ways, they're sort of like guiding principles, right? And that's what you're doing with your SOPs. You're going, well, let's go just do the best. Let's clean this up and do the best. And and then we'll follow and be informed and follow the rules and comply, and do everything that you need to do. You'll probably come out okay, when you have that sort of attitude. But clearly, like you said, chairs of boards, CEOs, others who aren't directly involved in compliance, they get weirded out by the whole thing and go, well, this is a nightmare. What do you mean we did something wrong? I thought we were clear, that kind of
Yeah.
situation.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, there's a couple of reasons for that. I think one, sometimes there's an over reliance on employees. If you hire an employee that maybe has an unbelievable pedigree, but the work product doesn't match the pedigree. Sometimes you get that, especially when you're dealing with hiring retired or semi-retired people that don't have a major stake in it, and maybe they don't necessarily need the income. They're doing it for golf money or different reasons. Maybe there's different motivations. So I think an over reliance on employees sometimes ends up catching them off guard. Like, hey, that person used to work for DEA, so I'm covered. They know what they're doing.
Yeah.
I think that's part of it. I think that the other part of it is, I think, trying to balance the cost with the competitive edge piece. How do we maintain the bottom line? If we spend, everything we have on compliance, the company may not be able to survive, especially for, small to mid-sized companies. They really have to, carefully review those budgets because they get a lot of mouths to feed, and with inflation and rising costs and rising healthcare costs all over the country, I think that's a challenge. It's something that they have to think about. And so how do we get the most value in our DEA compliance or in our, quality programs? How do we do that without breaking the bank?
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
so
I
that's a
think
challenge.
Yeah, I think the other thing that happens, I used to have a lawyer years ago in the public company space. So when we take companies public, we deal at that level, that regulatory environment, which is, very onerous, the Securities and Exchange Commission. And so you're constantly having these discussions about, well, is that allowed? How do we have to disclose that? In that world, it's mostly about disclosure. It's kind of like you can do whatever you want as long as you tell everybody. That's kind of the way to think about it. But he used to say, it was a good line, this 20, 30 years ago, but he said, well, there's always the good business defense. And he said, what that is things are going well, you're okay. It's when things aren't going well. And so when you take a deal like you're talking about Miami-Luken, part of the problem is that they were around for 40 years and never had a problem. You get a complacency thing going. And that's where the old employees are like, well, why mess with it? We've never had a problem, right? Well, you've just been lucky. That's all.
Yeah.
The circumstances just didn't align to where you had the vulnerability in your systems all along, but you were just lucky. Nothing happened. But when that thing happened, you didn't have the system in place to protect you.
Yep.
That's what a lot of that is. I think that this compliance discussion is that you have to do the work, but you do want to focus on being efficient and thoughtful and smart as to how you go about doing it. I do find that some companies are just, they go down the road about how expensive it is to do everything. But then when you analyze it, they're just stupid in the way that they spend money and they hire people and they're not giving it they might be really efficient at this part of their business, whatever that is, operations, sales, marketing, accounting, but they don't apply that sort of efficiency thinking over here into this other part of the business. That's just, my little bit of experience.
Well, and Tony, when you think about it, I always try to put it in perspective for people because a lot of times when folks will call us looking for some sort of support, whether it's, DEA related, or it's a quality project or accreditation or licensing or whatever the case may be, it's litigation, whatever. When somebody calls me, a lot of times they don't have a realistic understanding of what something should even cost. I spend a lot of times telling folks, I'm like, listen, and I'll give you an example. Let's say you contacted me and you said, hey, I want you to come out to my facility and do an audit. And how much does an audit cost? And I tell you what an audit costs, and you're like, that's a lot of money. I don't know that we want to spend. We have internal people that can do that, so why should we engage you? And then, I spend time explaining why I think external is a benefit to them, because it kind of removes the bias of the fox guarding the hen house.
Mm-hmm.
You have a third party. It helps prevent the stakeholders from, looking like they have just biased people working for the company. So there's a lot of benefits. It gives you the ability to enhance areas that maybe your internal folks didn't see because they're too close to it. Yeah. Whatever. I'll go through a lot of those sort of things, but I say, listen, here's what you have to think about. A single DEA record-keeping fine, just a record-keeping fine, is approximately $19,000. A single record-keeping fine. Now, our cost to come in and do a one-day audit or inspection isn't that. And so when you think about that, you put that into perspective. Normally, those types of issues are systemic. So there's multiple record-keeping issues, or there's multiple record formatting issues or reporting issues or things of that nature. The value you get from that one-day inspection is substantially more than what you pay for that inspection. So I have to spend a lot of time, unfortunately, telling people that, because they don't really know what non-compliance costs, or they've been so comfortable or complacent with the fact that they haven't had enforcement or they haven't had a run-in with the DEA. But that also can change at any point in time. And you also have to decide there's a reputation cost. When this comes out in the press that you were fined by DEA for all of these violations, what partnerships do you lose? What relationships do you lose? It's just, a lot of times it's not worth it when you can do small things that have a tremendous benefit. So we spend a lot of time, unfortunately, explaining why you do it when people call. And the assumption from me is they called because they want it or they need it. But a lot of times I have to explain the why to them. So
going back to Miami-Luken, they're the ultimate example of the cost of the failure, right? So that was a unique, like you're saying, a unique experience, because you lived sort of the front line of a crises, in compliance, let's call it. I mean, that's what it was, right? And so, a couple of things. Why don't you mention, you did actually testify in Congress? What was that story about?
So, so midway through, I'll give you a little quick background on this. Shortly after I came into Miami-Luken, maybe 3, 4, 5 months, the DEA issued Miami-Luken an order to show cause, which is really the DEA's enforcement attempt to take away the company's registration, their right to distribute controlled substances. If they don't have that, they cannot distribute controlled substances. So they give you this order to show cause, and then your defense begins. How do we defend? What's the reason that the DEA, or what reasons can we give them to prove to them that we deserve to keep our registration? You're then very much on the defensive of, we have to figure out a way, because if this happens, the company obviously goes under. The employees will not have their jobs anymore. So it's a pretty serious enforcement activity.
The DEA at that point is pissed off, and they're just looking to, I mean, you got some regulators pretty angry at you at that juncture. Is what it sounds like to me.
And usually there's a long list, a chain of alleged compliance failures that lead to
your way up to that level. Yeah,
exactly. So that was sort of the first pretty serious enforcement step that was taken, and it affected the company's partnerships, relationships. The public opinion of the company was not good. There were press releases. It was very difficult. How do we assure our customers, the pharmacies, that we're still going to be able to deliver to them, because they're worried they won't get their shipments for their patients. And so the number of things happen when that sort of event occurs that really just doesn't meet the eye, that most people don't know happens behind the scenes. So that's sort of the first step, was that order to show cause. Shortly after that, the Department of Justice filed criminal charges against Miami-Luken, the president at the time, Tony Rattini, and James Barclay, who was the former compliance guy that was sort of fulfilling the role that I was before I arrived. And that was another, very serious thing. Yeah. Now we've got criminal charges on top of an attempted revocation of registration. So it just went from bad to worse. And the whole while I'm, restructuring SOPs, refining the suspicious order monitoring process, meeting with vendors, doing external audits on customers, and writing reports and showing where we've made improvements and how many folks we've reported to DEA and state boards of pharmacy, and how aggressive our compliance efforts are. Very proactive, really, in trying to keep that.
And thinking that undercover police job wasn't all that bad.
Yeah. Well, it's funny.
Through a window, but in some ways it's less painful than what I'm living through right now.
I remember Tony Rattini came into my office one day, and this was shortly after the order to show cause, and he could tell that I was clearly stressed out, to the max. And he said, well, at least you're not getting shot at. And I thought, you know what? I mean, as funny as that was, it did kind of put things in perspective. I thought, I guess it could be worse.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that's sort of, there was an avalanche sort of event, a cascade of bad things that just continued to occur. And then the United States Congress, the Energy and Commerce Committee, launched an investigation into alleged pill dumping into West Virginia, is what their investigation was called, or something along those lines. This was 2017 timeframe. And with congressional investigations, a lot of people don't really know how those work, but there is no such thing as privilege in a congressional investigation. So any conversation that you have with your attorneys or internal counsel or really any confidential communications that you could allege occurred, there is no such thing as confidentiality. So it's kind of unfortunate when you're in the middle of a defense situation that now everything that you've ever discussed in any capacity, and mind you, things can be taken out of context in any sort of investigation or any email, or you take a snippet of something and that doesn't always give the full picture. So it was really kind of a nerve-wracking time of, okay, now we have to turn over everything to the United States Congress that we've ever discussed, even with our legal counsel on, how do we address this or that or our defense. So that was really, really unique. And at some point, the company's attorney came to me and he said, I'd like for you to do a telephone conversation with the congressional staffers, and they have some questions for you. And I was the only guy. I was like, I wasn't here for a lot of the stuff, that 99.9% of what happened, I wasn't even there for. So I'm like, are you sure I'm the best guy to be doing this conversation? And they're like, you're the only guy. So I'm like, well, I guess I'm going to go talk to the folks at the United States Congress. And I remember being very nervous about it, because you don't get any cliff notes on what they're going to ask you. They can ask you anything. And it was really, at the end of it, I felt a lot better, because I really saw it as an opportunity to educate the folks in Congress on what information DEA has, what information they review, what types of things we were doing as a company, what sort of enhancements were made, what sort of things that, that the DEA reviewed in the course of their investigations, and kind of it put me in the position of an educator for those folks. And I really, at the end of it all, you could tell they were fairly engaged and interested. We were talking about, ARCOS reporting and, what sort of transaction information DEA has in the supply chain, and what information is known, and what we were doing to investigate pharmacies, and how we were approaching that, and what we were required to do by law versus what we did, just as a control, or as a, corporate citizen in trying to do the right thing. And so it really ended up being a positive experience, in my opinion. Not that I would want to go back and do it again, but it also made me one of a very small group of experts that have ever had the opportunity to do something like that. So I sort of had lemons, and I made lemonade with the situation you could do that.
Yeah, it's really a very interesting kind of baptism by fire, scenario, as you moved into compliance. So ultimately, though, what happened was you moved on from there, and is that when you set up GTC?
Yeah. So I at the time, this was shortly after the congressional testimony, I went to the company president and I said, hey, I feel like I've done everything that I can do here. I've brought the company as far as I can from a regulatory perspective, and stayed through the litigation and criminal charges and congressional testimony, and was very loyal, because I felt that, tremendous responsibility to even just the employees. Right. And I said, I think I'm gonna, I'd like to go out on my own. I know that this company isn't the only company that has these sort of problems. And I feel like what I've learned here would be a tremendous benefit to others. And maybe I can prevent companies like Miami-Luken, those small to mid-sized distributors, from going down that same sort of path of complacency or naivete, or, navigate some of those things. And so I said, you know what, I think this is what I want to do. I think this will fulfill my purpose, and I'm going to go out and start GTC Consulting. So that was in March of 2018. I still consulted for Miami-Luken for a small period of time, like 6 months, just helping them, during that phase. But it was sometime during that time frame that the criminal charges against the company and against the former president and former compliance guy were dropped. So that was sort of a final testament to the efforts that, myself and the company's legal counsel really put into trying to steer the ship.
I think it's remarkable. I don't know any of the details, but, to get the government to drop is, unusual that they would go that far with a complaint and then, let it go in the end.
Yeah, it certainly is. It's extremely rare, especially considering, the country was in an opioid crisis, and considering the rhetoric and the news media that was behind that entire event, and behind everything that was happening. It was definitely not a foreseeable circumstance, I would say, by any means. So but it ended up being sort of a good push-off point for GTC Consulting, that, we really can, even in dire circumstances, and I mean, some of that's a grace of God thing, but even in dire circumstances, the wisdom that I applied to Miami-Luken, I think really did a lot of good. I mean, it really helped them to the extent that was possible. And my preference always is that a company seek help before they ever get to that situation. Always be one step ahead, always be preparing, There's a statement, I think Mike Tyson made it. Everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face.
Yeah, that's right. And man, that's our job. Yeah.
And so,
Yeah.
but
That's
you gotta plan to be punched in the face. That's the thing is it's going to happen at some time. And what are you going to
I have
do
a
about it? And so
I have a great
that's
friend
key.
who's a Navy SEAL, and he talks about, when you're shooting a gun, at something or at a target, he says completely different when it shoots back. He said it changes,
Yeah.
when there's somebody at the other end shooting back. He says it's all different, like it's different, right? So you got
Yeah,
to plan until the turn comes at you. So GTC, you and I are working on a project that's similar, in the sense of medical, wholesale drug distribution licensing. But is that your main client type, or what? What all are you serving there?
yeah.
Yeah,
So really, we're a little bit unique in that I would say our client type is fairly broad. And what I mean by that is we have done some incredibly unique things as a consultancy. I think first of all because we're not afraid to approach or venture into new horizons and try new things, and we don't shy away from challenges. And a big part of that is the team that I hire has that same approach, but that's sort of been my approach. I'm not a guy that's near retirement, and my reputation, the company's reputation, is incredibly important to me. So,
right.
I
Yeah,
really tie my success to my clients. The clients' results really, truly matter to me. I mean, to the extent that somebody can say, I'll treat your business like it's mine, I really mean that, because in my eyes, it is mine. Your partnership is incredibly important to me. And so we approach everything that way. So when somebody comes to me and let's say we're not engaged, we've never done business together, and they have a challenging situation, maybe that others have refused to take on, because we've dealt with that where just some companies are like, I'm not touching that. That's too risky. It's too hard. It's too difficult. It's not in our wheelhouse. We say, bring on the challenge, because it's an opportunity for me to learn and to grow. And I'm going to fight for that client to be successful in it to the best of my ability. Now, with new challenges like that, where you have, and I'll give you an example. A couple of years ago, we brought on a client that was a pretty big university client that was conducting research with a Schedule I drug, and they had a DEA consultancy helping them. Well, they dropped out. I don't know if it was too challenging, too complex. I don't know all the circumstances there, but they sort of ghosted them in the middle of the project. And so we came in and said, yeah, we'll do it. We'll do it. And there were 25 plus universities involved in this research project. So, multiple states. And we talked about how licensing is complex, and it's overlapping, and you have state licensing and then federal registration. And you can imagine how significantly that complexity was elevated with a Schedule I drug. And so in the middle of it, we had to select manufacturers. I went over to Canada and vetted some manufacturers for the project and did some other unique things for them. But I had to get all these research physicians licensed across multiple jurisdictions in a short amount of time on a federal grant project. And it was incredibly complex, incredibly difficult. No one else would do it. We did it. We did it tremendously well, so well that the company, or that the university that was hosting the study, said, "Hey, we need somebody to go to the FDA and get an investigative new drug application approved for this drug we want to research." And I'm like, "We've never done that before." And they're like, "Well, you did this so well, we want you to do this also." And I'm like, oh my gosh, I don't even know where to start. So I started to, get the right people and, find the right solution.
yeah.
Within 30 days of submitting our investigational new drug application to the FDA, it was approved.
No.
which is incredibly remarkable. But it's a testament to the challenge doesn't matter to us. It doesn't matter what the challenge is. If it falls in the vein of risk management or licensing or regulatory compliance in that umbrella, we are willing to take it on.
So you touch everything from manufacturing to distribution, I suppose, probably to end user pharmacy type applications as well, right? So really
Absolutely.
the whole drug supply chain. Do you guys get overseas at all? I mean, a lot of as we talk about a, a great deal, and whatever number you want to use, 75 to 90% is manufactured overseas. Are you touching that process at all, or how do you interact with that?
Yes, absolutely. We've had several clients that have been out of country. Some of those projects are unique. We've had, for example, we've had folks in Ireland contact us that, with things such as, hey, our board is exploring manufacturing or exporting this drug. Can you help give us guidance, or can you pull together a slide deck that we can present to the stakeholders? So even small nuanced things you might not think would fall into this umbrella, we get those types of things. We've worked with companies that produce drug addiction treatment drugs in other countries. We've done work with them that have some sort of import-export related investigation happening that they need support to identify where counterfeit product is coming in, or perhaps where they're losing product if they're having thefts or losses. We do security assessments for big, very large distributors and repackagers, especially those that do the semi-glutide stuff or the high-value drug product stuff. They'll have us help them design facilities from the ground up. So we'll do, biometric scanning systems and interlocking doors. And so it's really quite broad, but we're definitely sort of expanding our global reach.
Yeah. Just generally speaking, I mean, how does compliance work, in the global supply chain? I mean, when you think about, if you go all the way back to the raw material level, you got a lot of product moving through a lot of stages in a lot of countries. And, how effective just would you say that is? And then just generally, I mean, how does it work? You know, how do
It,
we
it,
know what we're really getting?
it, it's extremely complex. And I think that's why the gray market product problem exists. I mean, and I'll give you another example on just gray market product. And let's not think about drugs. We'll put those to the side for a minute. But
Yeah.
diabetic needles, right? You can order diabetic needles from another country. You don't know if those diabetic needles have been recycled, if they've been repackaged, if they've come from a nursing home or a hospital. You have to, even as a consumer, you have to be very careful about where you source things from, because the consequences could be very, very dire.
Well, the diabetic needle thing you're bringing up, because that's actually a shortage item on and off because of the demand of the semaglutide and Ozempic world. So those are typically diabetic needles that everybody's using there. I know they've been in short supply because we get those calls. I hadn't really thought about the recycling problem. That's to your point on the drug side. You and I are very aware of a company that's in the middle of a drug recycling problem, a drug distributor that had a AIDS-related product that they allegedly were buying off of the gray market. And it's that recycling idea, which I was really, surprised to hear that allegation. Not always surprised that it happened because everything happens, but just that it was able to happen. I mean, it took a fair amount of coordination, if it really occurred, to do what they did. They were allegedly drugs were flowing through the prescription process, and they were buying them from patients and then recycling back, is allegedly and apparently what happened. But I could see that in the needle deal. To your point, it's interesting. They pulled that off efficiently, but when you go off in China and India and places where you have massive volumes occurring. Yeah,
Well,
Africa. Yeah,
and it happens. Sadly, it happens even in the United States with recycling and repackaging, where you have companies that maybe aren't operating with ethics and integrity. Uh, it's something that happens. I mean, it's something I'm aware of that has occurred multiple times in this country, where folks will go and they'll buy, half a thing of diabetic needles or something somewhere, and then they'll resell those. But the problem is you don't know what conditions or circumstances those have been in or used under. And obviously they can slash the price on those if they obtained them from a nursing home or a hospital, perhaps, that went under or sold or had some sort of issue, or, put them out to pasture. Basically, they were getting rid of it, and somehow somebody managed to get their hands on it. Maybe they were sent for destruction,
right.
uh,
Yeah,
or
exactly.
recall.
Yeah, or recall. Yeah, and then sent for destruction. It's the provenance problem. And, one of the things I was talking about, like in Amazon, for example, the Amazon system, the Amazon marketplace, it's a marketplace. It's third-party sellers. And so, you don't really know the provenance of a product because they pool their inventory. So if there's 10 companies selling the same needle on Amazon, and you go online and you buy a needle from one of those companies, Amazon is just pulling it from the pooled inventory. So you're not necessarily getting the box of needles supplied by the seller that you think it's supply side. You're just getting it based on the SKU and the packaging that Amazon calls, the common item. There's no provenance tracking in that most simple example. But when you get off into this more broad, in this global world, I mean, to your point, we can't track what's going on in the United States. I don't know how we track what's going on globally, all the way back to raw material. Yeah. So it's a real challenge.
It is. It's a real challenge, and I think FDA, which is a relatively small agency, especially given the scope of their responsibilities, has tried to tackle this for years, and there's not a super definitive and clear path. They've tried with DSCSA and some of these regulations to do a better job of tracking these things, but these are massive undertakings that take a lot of time and effort and a lot of industry support to accomplish, and they're just not done overnight, unfortunately.
Well, the problem is globally, the FDA doesn't have legal authority in China or India, for example. It can request to do certain things and arrangements can be made, but they don't have authority. They don't have a legal position. They're a foreign, they're from a foreign, government. The other interesting thing about India is the provinces or the states. They're much more independent than here in the United States. In the United States, we do have an overarching set of laws and a strong federal government, and we have one language, allegedly official language, but we generally speak English here. But in India, they're very different. When you go from state to state, they're actually very different language, different set of regulations, different government structure, surprisingly. And if you're, born in one state and then you begin to interact with others, there's a very good chance you don't speak that language. So they're very fragmented, relatively speak. They're not as homogenous as you think from a regulatory and kind of government, uh, perspective. So it's a challenge, for sure. And the DSCSA, that's finally going into effect, now, I guess, is the deal. And what is, give everybody just a, 2 minute on, well, what is that? How does it work kind of thing?
Yeah. So the FDA, really, I want to say this was around maybe 2014 timeframe is when they really started to pursue this, implementation of this DSCSA, which is the Drug Supply Chain and Security Act, is what it stands for. And essentially what the goal is, or was to be able to track prescription drugs through the entirety of the supply chain, with pretty finite accuracy, almost down to the bottle, is the ultimate goal. And who knows, maybe they can figure out a way to make that down to the pill one day. We'll see. But, and it's sort of progressively stepped by, lot tracking and different things. But essentially the goal is to track medications as they flow from the manufacturer all the way down to the patient when they're dispensed from the pharmacy. And it requires a tremendous amount of effort from the supply chain to be able to make those things happen, to identify transaction history statements and information, THTSTI. And it involves scanning of the product, which that's been one of the biggest complexities is, how does the industry accomplish this without scanning each individual bottle? And when you're receiving, large quantities of drugs, you're not unpackaging them as you're shipping them downstream necessarily. So it's a time consuming thing. It's a logistics challenge. It's a software challenge. But I think the goal is a good one. I really do. I think the goal is a good one. Do I think it will solve all the problems? No, I don't think it will. I think you're still going to have issues with online pharmacies, for example, being a major problem. People are looking for ways to source their medication and medical devices as cheaply as possible. And there are many online rogue pharmacies that are willing to take your money and provide you something. Hopefully it's what you bought, but that's a major risk on your part. So I think awareness is a big thing. People have to start doing due diligence on where they source their products from. They need reliable sources.
Yeah. Yeah. It's, to your point, I mean, we do, logistics and, if we receive a container and that container's got pallets, those pallets have cases, those cases have boxes, and those boxes have bottles. Yeah, it's very complicated to figure out the serial numbers of each individual bottle on that container and properly track it. The idea is what came in, what went out and where it went to, right? That's sort of our part of that job. And it's extremely complex. And it's barely being implemented now, and then it goes all the way back to, well, again, if it's a company from China, pick on them, but, how compliant are they going to be? You don't have any ability to enforce them, really. You can take away their 510K or whatever, but, easier said than done, especially when we're so dependent upon them.
Yep.
And we don't have a plan B. So you can't really say, well, you quit making that drug because we might not have anybody else making that drug. It's a little bit more complex than it sounds like. So what do you see happening in the future? So what does the future of compliance hold? Where do we go next in this business?
That's an interesting question. It's hard to say. I don't see, I see temporarily at least regulations not necessarily increasing substantially, at least in the near future. But I think long term that we're going to see regulations intensify around drug distribution, drug manufacturing. It's like you mentioned at the start, there's those kind of highly regulated industries where firearms, alcohol, tobacco, pharmaceuticals certainly definitely fall into the highly regulated category. So I think you're going to see more and more of it. I'm excited about the prospect of artificial intelligence and where we're at in terms of technology and software today as to how those can be utilized to provide solutions. I don't think you'll ever be able to completely remove, this is for compliance folks out there. There will always need to be decision makers that review the information, that help develop the strategies, that implement these programs and make sure they're effective and test them from a quality perspective. So I don't think those sort of jobs are going away. I think if anything, they're just going to change a little bit. I think they're going to be more of a strategy component and more of a review and accuracy and confirmation. And then certainly in litigation, I think AI is a helpful tool also. So, it's hard to say, but I'm excited about the solutions that I think will be in the marketplace. I think the supply chain is going to become a lot more efficient, and
Yeah.
hopefully that will reduce errors and some of the issues that we're seeing.
Well, that's, what we're doing. We have our application, we call it MetaCommerce RX, but it's the idea of an AI powered supply chain management system. We refer, our tagline is smarter supply, better care. But the idea there just fundamentally is that there's so much data that, without AI, you can't process it properly, right? If you're trying to find millions of products worldwide all the way through the supply chain, and you have 1,000 different prices for every product. You got like literally a billion different data points. You can't manage it the old-fashioned way. So, what we're trying to do is build an application that learns, because that's really the ultimate with AI is you want it to learn, right? So we want to pull data from around the world and do everything we can to create a more intelligent system. You're absolutely right. At the end of the day, it's always going to be about people then using that intelligence. Really, the thing that happens with AI today, and as I'm a software developer, and this is what we do. We're a software company, but I don't know that it's really intelligence. What it is it's phenomenally high level computing power like we've never seen in our lives before. And it's going to continue to compound at an unbelievable rate, even more. But essentially with ChatGPT and Grok and the other, competitors in that world, Anthropic, really what's happening is you gain access to a mega computer. It's the Grok computer, I think they call it the Colossal, but it's like the largest computer in the world. Well, if you use Grok, which is the X, Twitter, machine, then you have access to that computer. That's really kind of what's happening is you gain access to these supercomputers, basically, far more powerful than any supercomputer that ever existed in our history. I believe the Colossal computer, which is made up of 10,000 NVIDIA CPUs, and I believe they're doubling that to around 20,000, is the most powerful computer on the planet, and you get to use it by going, to Grok. And it's similar with ChatGPT on a different scale. Well, when you get that massive computing power, you can begin to do things that we can hardly even imagine. So, to your point, I think that I always tell people it's actually a time to be optimistic. People are all kind of wound up in pessimism right now, but it's really a time to be optimistic is because these new technologies will come to bear, right? And, if we go all the way back to your Miami-Luken story, if there had been AI there tracking every data point that ever occurred in that company for the 20 previous years, it probably would have revealed the error sooner. Now, it still requires a good decision maker at the top to not be greedy and to take that information, right? That's the key. Because it's a lot of times it comes down to, well, yeah, I shouldn't, but gee, I could make this. That's called greed. And so it still requires that moral fortitude, but they could at least be armed with data, and probably the broader team would have been armed. So not just maybe the leader, the CEO, or whoever, but a much bigger group of people. And I don't know the details of that circumstance, but I'm just saying, generally speaking, in our world of compliance, the more information, the better. And there's a lot of stuff flowing every day. Right.
I had to create tools, Tony, to be able to analyze data. So sort of the step before AI, I was creating tools internally to parse and look at data to make decisions upon, which took a substantial amount of time. So I'm excited about, having AI as a tool, because it will make companies and GTC Consulting so much more efficient, and so you get a lot more, I think, value really from consulting firms and stuff that utilize those types of things in reviewing data. And so I'm excited about it. We're really going from, in my mind, a hammer to a nail gun sort of approach here, and it's just so much faster, so much better in terms of how quickly it can look at so many data points and give you information. Now, it's got to be reviewed, it's got to be validated, of course, but you take a substantial amount of that effort out of the picture, and that's huge.
Yeah, I totally agree. And then that way you can afford to, going back to our conversation about the high cost of compliance, well, now, yeah, you're smarter at compliance. You can afford to invest in the compliance properly, and you're more likely, to do the compliance that you need to do. I can tell you that in our experience, we have software developers, and over the years, I mean, I've spent, I don't even know, tens of millions, probably $100 million or more on programming over 20, 30 years. And seriously, what we used to have, going back 20 years ago, what took 100 people 3 years ago took 5 people, and today you could do a chat GPT.
Yep.
Yeah, it's just the way it is. Yeah.
That's
And so, our ability to write code is phenomenal. Now you still need your designer, you still need your engineers, you need that leadership piece, that creativity piece. But man, the ability to crank out code has changed completely in the last 12 to 18 months. So what
Yep.
is it going to do in 3 to 5 years? And so what we're trying to do is apply that logic to this drug security problem. I really view it as like a provenance problem, and that is the whole supply chain back and forth. The work that you've been doing a lot, you've expanded it out to that global. You've gone up the river on the supply chain to the manufacturing level. Most people in your space are just dealing with the end game, the final mile. They're dealing with the kind of the wholesale distributor to the pharmacy or to the healthcare provider. So, but that's where most people have gone. Now you've kind of, because of your, sort of creativity, you're willing to go to other places, and you're touching, that broader supply chain, which frankly is where the bigger problem is, because it's less controllable. That's, or more, let's just call it more challenging. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, there's certainly, in my opinion, there's a much bigger target there. It's really hard it's really hard to get a lot of value after pursuing, one physician or one pharmacy or, one downstream bad actor. So I think there's a lot of focus on manufacturing and distribution from an enforcement perspective, from a litigation perspective, because those are profitable organizations, and so that's the reality. Is if you follow the money, that's sort of how that works, unfortunately, and so you got to be prepared. I mean, you just got to be prepared.
Well, the interesting thing, and we should start to wrap up a little bit, when you talk about the global, problem or opportunity, however you want to think about it, but I don't care if you're making fentanyl or you're making Advil, or, Ozempic, doesn't really matter. The opportunity is in the United States of America, right? That's the deal. We are such a massive economic opportunity for the good drugs and the bad drugs that wherever they are in the world, their goal is to get into the U.S. That's really the deal. The size of our economy is, of course, largest in the world, and it's so big and powerful. And our healthcare market is, the biggest in the world. You people get in an argument about is it the best or is it highest cost and all those. I think those are very legitimate concerns. I'm very concerned about our high cost of healthcare here. But at the end of the day, we're for now anyhow, we're the golden goose. We're where everybody wants to go. So that means we have to project out our control mechanisms into this supply chain. That's,
Yep.
yeah. Whether it's a fentanyl that we got to shut down or it's, semaglutide that we've got to regulate. Either way, we need to
Uh,
reach out somehow.
Agreed. And
Yeah.
we've been able to leverage that some, Tony, with relationships that we've built for our clients with other countries manufacturing is, sort of in negotiations, leveraging the fact that they want to get to the U.S. market. So we can put certain circumstances upon them that maybe their government doesn't, and say, hey, this is the criteria you have to meet. And if you really are serious about getting the U.S. market, this is a big opportunity for you to get in the
Yeah.
market. But we have to make sure that this is done the right way. And in order to do that, we need to see A, B, C, D done. And a lot of times that, as long as there's some accountability there, from my experience, a lot of those foreign manufacturers that get those contracts, they are willing to do the right thing and follow those steps. And if they don't, you call them on it and you say, hey, you need to do this better, and risk losing your opportunity in the U.S. market. And so they typically, from my experience, have been very willing to make those changes. And so I think we have that ability here in the U.S. when we work with outside, manufacturers.
Yeah, we have that leverage. Yeah,
Correct.
absolutely. Hey, Ben, I appreciate you joining us today. It was a great conversation. Love to dig into it more in the future. But man, you got a phenomenal background, lots of great insight. So thank you for joining us. I really appreciate it very much.
Thank you, Tony. Like I said, it's an honor to be here, and I enjoyed the conversation.
Great. Thanks, Ben. We'll see you soon.